abnormality, a congenital brain abnormality called agenesis of the corpus callosum. So this is two midline MRI views of the brain of two different individuals. The individual on the left is ostensibly normal. And you can see my corpus callosum as that red sort of white ball pen hammer sort of shaped thing that is in the middle of that red circle. That is 200 million neurons coursing between the right and left sides of the brain and interconnecting the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. So you're seeing the cross section of what's like a trunk line. If you cut it in cross section, you're looking at it. On the right, you see the kind of individual we study that as a person with agenesis or absence of the corpus callosum or absence of that structure. So you can see in that little red circle that there is no corpus callosum. So something at the end of the first trimester, beginning of the second trimester pregnancy happens to where a precursor bridge that would cross the two sides of the brain doesn't develop, and so the axons of the brain begin to migrate and want to go across the middle. They don't go across the middle, they go front to back, and so you get this piece of people born without a corpus callosum. Now you would think with 200 million neurons gone that the people would be profoundly retarded, but in fact the people we study all have an IQ above 80 and are relatively normally functioning, and our challenge in life is to figure out what are the consequences of not having these 200 million neurons in the context in which a person is functioning relatively well in the normal intelligence range. I'm also at Fuller Theological Seminary. Our school has three schools: a school of theology, a school of intercultural studies, and a school of psychology. And it's a clinical psychology PhD program, PhD and PsyD program. And I teach in that program, and I teach the neuropsychology and neurobiology part of that curriculum. But the fact that I'm in a theological seminary means a whole lot of questions come up for me that probably don't come up for a lot of my colleagues working in the same area I'm working in. Things like, how do you understand the philosophy of mind? What is the relationship between neuroscience and human nature? How do you understand the brain and free will? What is the relationship between science generally and religious experience and faith? And so I get involved in all those conversations, whether I like it or not, because I'm there at the seminary and hold into these arguments or these discussions. So this comes out a lot of that, including work I've done with a philosopher friend of mine who was, I don't know, it hasn't been in this forum, but it was one in Sioux Falls several years ago. Nancy Murphy was a philosopher and theologian in Fuller. So a lot of this thinking is collaboration with my theology and philosophy colleagues. But part of the reason I tell you that is I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not a theologian, I'm a neuropsychologist. But I'm going to be talking about things that are somewhat philosophical and somewhat theological. So I'll probably be a little less deep in those areas than I am in the neuroscience I talk about. So let me start out with some questions, just to kind of seed our thinking. So how many essential parts or substances am I composed of? So am I a body and a soul, a body and a mind, a body, a mind, and a soul, a body, a mind, a soul, a spirit, a self, ego? Am I a committee? Does my behavior and self emanate out of a lot of different parts? Or am I one thing, a body, a person? So are these parts or are these descriptions of a whole? And as you'll see as we go on here, my thought is that these are rich descriptions of complex whole persons, not parts. So here's the outline of what I'm going to talk about in these naughty problems. You detected that pun there. First of all, I'm going to talk about two sort of basic, almost two polar opposites, theories of human nature. Then I'm going to talk about the neuroscience of humanness in three areas. Actually, there are four that you could talk about that are areas that have been assigned to the unique properties of a soul. One is rationality. That's what Descartes did. And it's not hard for all of us. We all kind of know the neuroscience of rationality and brain damage and stroke and Alzheimer's disease and all of that. The other is human relatedness. Another would be moral behavior, and the last one would be religious experience. So I'm going to talk about the neuroscience studies, kind of sample the neuroscience studies done with respect to those questions. And then I'm going to talk about an alternative formulation of human nature that I think maybe unties a little bit some of the knotty problems. So first, the two basic theories of human nature. So here's two kind of conflicting, sort of at the ends of the polar ends of the continuum views of human nature. So proposition one is humans are physical beings who also have non-material souls or mind, and it is the soul or mind that is rational, free, uniquely human, and allows us to experience God. And so our religiousness or spirituality is due to the fact that we have a soul, a non-material body. This is called body-soul dualism, so I'll often refer to this as just dualism. It has its origins in Plato, really, the idea that there are the forms that are non-material and are what is real, and the physical life that we experience is just sort of a reflection or shadow of what is real that's non-material in the life of the forms. And so body-soul dualism kind of comes out of that philosophic tradition. It came into to faith and Christian faith, particularly through St. Augustine, who was a Neoplatonist and brought this very deeply, this idea of Plato of the material and the non-material into Christian thought. And was really sort of gelled and formed kind of explicitly by Descartes, and Descartes' idea of body and mind and the fact that we are, Descartes thought that humans and animals and whatever were basically machines, with the exception of the fact he could not imagine how human rationality could come out of anything physical. So he said we had to have at least one soul, and that was the rational mind or soul. And so you get a very strong mind-body or soul-body dualism out of Descartes that's been fairly influential in a lot of thinking in Western thought, even when you don't think you're referring back to Descartes. So I was talking with somebody yesterday, and they said something about, as a physician, people are saying, they worry about the fact that this is all in my mind. And the statement, this is all in my mind, is basically a Cartesian statement. It's a statement as if the mind is something different than the body. And so that Descartes' ideas kind of run through Western culture in very significant ways. So it pervades modern Christian and religious views. So most religious views are in at least Western culture and many other cultures are dualist in this sense. And it has a wide influence, as I say, in secular thought. One interesting thing to me is that a lot of the neuroscientists that would deny Cartesian materialism or Cartesian dualism would have basically substituted a brain-body dualism for Cartesian mind-body dualism, partly because our thinking is so captured by the fact that everything rational has got to be in here and captured in something, and so it's now the brain rather than a soul or mind. So, and it also has sort of secular spirituality is very dualist and Gnostic, actually, in that sense. So here's the other view. Humans are a neurobiological being whose mind, also soul and religious experience and relationality and everything else you want to put in there, moral agency, whatever, can, in theory, be exhaustively explained by neurochemistry and ultimately by physics. And an important point on exhaustively, not that these explanations are not important, it's just whether they're exhaustive. And this is called eliminative materialism, that is, mind as an explanation for behavior can be eliminated, because mind is basically epiphenomenal, the real phenomena are happening at the biological or subcellular level. This is believed by some scientists and philosophers that, you know, it's, Churchlands are down in San Diego and are philosophers and write a lot about this. Jacques Monod was a Nobel laureate in physiology, and B.F. Skinner was a psychologist, basically had this kind of a limited materialist understanding of human life. But obviously this is psychologically, theologically, and ethically problematic. It's psychologically problematic in the sense that my thinking is entirely epiphenomenal and deciding. It means nothing. That everything is determined by physics and chemistry. So this is a psychologically problematic point of view. It's theologically problematic because religious experience or religious life or whatever means particularly nothing when everything is reducible to physiology and physics. And it's ethically problematic because my moral behavior is entirely determined by my physiology and physics, and therefore it's not really moral or immoral, whatever else, it's just determined. So morality makes really very little sense in a limited materialism. So here's kind of the logic of limited materialism that is both reductionist, reducing to the lower level, and determinist. So physical processes are subject to the deterministic laws of physics. The brain, a physical object, is the basis of thought and behavior. So brain processes and the resulting behavior are governed by the laws of physics and are therefore determined. And that's kind of the logic out of which reductionism, determinism, and eliminative materialism derives. My friend and mentor at one point, I spent a year with Don Mackay. He was a neurophysiologist and information physicist in England. Don Mackay, in writing about this kind of stuff, called this view nothing buttery. And by this he meant that according to this view, only where physical explanation was impossible could any other account be taken seriously in its own right. Otherwise, the whole thing could be explained as nothing but the mindless motion of molecules. And I love that phrase, nothing but the mindless motion of molecules. Douglas Hofstadter, a philosopher at Stanford, recently wrote a book called I Am a Strange Loop, and was basically an attempt to understand personhood as some emergent property of complex systems. But Hofstadter writes, is what goes on inside our heads just a deterministic physical process? If so, are we all, no matter how idiosyncratic and sparkly, nothing but slaves to rigid laws governing the invisible particles out of which our brains are built? Could creativity ever emerge from a set of rigid rules governing minuscule objects? And that sets up the knotty problem, or one part of the knotty problem. So here's the two propositions that come out of this that kind of set the tension, and we'll talk a little in that and come back to something that might resolve the tension in some way. So dualism, if we have a non-physical soul or mind, how can one account for the impact of brain disorder on human cognitive capacities, moral agencies, and religious experiences? At the same time, if materialism is true, if humans are nothing but biology, where is human personhood, agency, value, and dignity to be found? So you're kind of on the horns of a dilemma in some respects, if these are the only two options available. Obviously they're not, but this at least makes some. So here's some illuminating question to help you start thinking about this. So the question is, does your dog have a soul? How many thinks your dog has a soul? Few of you, oh, that's pretty many. Most people say no. But the question is, if your dog doesn't have a soul, is your dog therefore a machine? And of course, my dog is not a machine. My dog's very relational and has emotions, interacted with me, but from the classical sense, certainly Descartes would have said that animals don't have souls, don't have rational minds or souls or power. And so a lot of classical thought, both religious and non-religious, is that yes, that the soul is the property of humankind and not of the animal world. But if that's what you believe, then you're kind of got attention. But at least kind of helps frame the problem. So now what I'm going to do, I want to jump into the world of neuroscience studies and frame those studies within the context of studies of the properties that at various times in the last couple thousand years are properties that have been assigned to the soul as uniquely human properties that the soul accounts for, that the body does not account for. And actually the four would be rationality, as I said, human relatedness, moral behavior, and religious experience. We all have a pretty good idea of the relationship between neurological disorder, neurological function, and rationality, and I want to talk about the other three. So first, human relatedness. This is an experiment that's done on the experience of fairness between people. And so this is fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, that shows the areas of the brain and the little colors that are active during what's called the ultimatum game. So in the ultimatum game, you and another person are playing the game, and the other person, let's say, is given a chunk of money, and then they just get to decide how much of that they're going to give to you. And so they decide some amount of money, and then when that's declared, then you decide whether you're going to accept it or reject it. But if you reject it, neither of you get any money. So in that sense, it's an ultimatum game. All right? Now, one would think if you're a utilitarian that any amount of money I'll accept because something's better than nothing, but obviously people don't do this. They consider some offers fair and other offers not fair, and they will reject unfair offers. So this is the brain's response to an unfair offer. All right, and so there are areas that are interestingly involved. The anterior cingulate cortex. The ears are out here. This is looking at a frontal section of the brain. This is the midline, and some areas on the midline, right on the midline on each side, called the anterior cingulate gyrus, are particularly active. Those are areas involved in integrating sort of limbic emotional experience with the rest of the brain, also involved in decision under uncertainty and kind of modulating the relationship between a whole lot of things going on the brain and behavior. And then the other interesting is bilateral area of the insula, right there. The insula is an area, even the temporal lobe, that gets information from my body and feeds it back through the insula into the rest of the brain. So the experience of disgust really activates the insula. So you see or smell or even see a picture of something that's just disgusting, and your body reacts to it, and that feeds through the insula, and you get this, you know, psychological but basically bodily response through the insula. But it also turns out to be really importantly involved in moral emotions generally. The insula is highly active in moral emotions. And then something in the right lateral prefrontal cortex having to do with a lot of our sort of higher level decision-making things, and the right side particularly involved in the use of emotion in decision-making. So the relational aspect of fair or not fair is something that there are interesting and trackable systems in our brains that are the sort of basis of our experience of fairness or not fairness. Another one is social inclusion and exclusion, and so this is a fMRI study. The person's in the scanner and they have on goggles that are basically computer screens, and so while they're laying there in the scanner and the brain's being scanned, they're playing a virtual reality game. And the virtual reality game is just a little ball passing game. So there's two other people and the ball is passed around, and in virtual reality, they throw the ball to you and you throw the ball back to them, and so you're sitting there playing this game. So after a while, they quit throwing you the ball. And so they play with the ball and you don't get thrown the ball anymore. So you're socially excluded, which like children are, we still have the same responses. So this idea of suddenly realizing one's socially isolated or excluded, again, the anterior cingulate will continually encounter that very important part in a whole lot of areas. And the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, a little more ventral, a little lower down prefrontal cortex. Then pain and empathy. This is done by Tanya Singer in Germany. She had people come into the lab who were volunteers to have their brains scanned or whatever in this experiment, but they brought a friend with them, a girlfriend or boyfriend or spouse or close friend, and they were there in the room in the scanner, and both of them had shock electrodes on their fingers. And so the person in the scanner would see a picture of hands and an arrow pointing to one of the hands, either your hand or their hand. And either you'll get shocked or your friend that you brought with you will get shocked. And what basically they found is the experience of empathy, which is actually, these are projected onto the surface. They're actually more deep within the brain than are shown in this graph. This is showing us the side of the brain, but projected on it, the color images of areas. This would be in the parietal cortex. This is probably actually down in the area of the insula. The insula is down there. But the point is that the experience of seeing your friend get a shock is very much mimicking the brain responses that occur when you get a shock. So for you to empathize with another person's pain is to simulate or emulate in your pain systems what it would feel like to get the shock that your friend is getting. So when we say, I feel your pain, in some sense, if you're really empathetic, that's actually literally true. At least our brains are simulating or emulating the experience of the pain that's being felt by the other person. And so empathy then is a interpersonal relationship pattern that have things going on in the brain that help us understand how those occur in some bodily sense. An important social interaction is what's called theory of mind. My theory of mind is my ability to understand something about what's going on in your mind, infer what's going on in your mind based on our history and your speech and what we're talking about and your body language and your eyes and what you're looking at. And there's all kinds of cues we use to infer the mind of another person. Persons with autism don't do this very well. And so we have been, the people we study with agenesis of the corpus callosum actually have an overlapping symptomatology with high-functioning autism. They're intelligent, but they have some social behavior. So we've been interested in this. But this was a test of the ability to infer mental and emotional activity. So you can watch this and see what you infer. You have a person watch this and then you say, tell me what you saw. Now, if I asked all of you in this room to tell me what you saw, you would could not help but telling a story that has intentionality, emotion, human interaction as the core of the story. It just immediately becomes that kind of story for you. When you ask a person with autism to tell you what they saw, they tell you about triangles moving around and a little door opening in. But they don't, there's no emotion, there's no human intentionality, there's no relational interactivity in the stories that people with autism tell. And so we've also done this with the agenesis of the corpus callosum, but we won't tell that story today. So Fulvia Castelli, who helped develop this test, at least the version that we saw, looked at the brains of individuals with autism who do not tell you the interpersonal story versus persons without autism matched for intelligence that tell you a normal interpersonal story. And an interpersonal story, it activates, again, the anterior cingulate area, areas in the right temporal sulcus or right sort of parietal temporal area, the amygdala, which is an important structure deep in the temporal lobe for emotion, particularly negative emotion and fear, whatever really activates the amygdala, but it gets modulated by social interactions, even if fear is not a big part. Of course, areas in the visual cortex get involved because it was a very visual scene that he had to analyze throughout this whole thing. But again, there are brain patterns that underlie our ability to make theory of mind inferences. And these are at least some of those theories. By the way, let me make an aside to anytime you look at things like this, like functional magnetic resonance imaging, you're always looking at the difference between condition A and condition B. And so you subtract out some control condition, which there would be sort of non-inferential patterns in which the triangles are moving around, or you look at autism versus controls, but you have to find some difference. So the point of saying that is a whole lot more of the brain is involved in this, but what you're seeing is the brain areas that are uniquely involved in this are most active, but it's a mistake to read what I'm showing you as it's just this little area and that little area are what, subserve this kind of function. In fact, it's a whole brain network of which these are the critical nodes because they're the ones that are most responsive to what it is you're looking at. Okay, so theory of mind, a really important part of our social relatedness. Now I want to move kind of from that into moral behavior. And this is, anybody in neurology knows the famous case of Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage was a worker on the railroad back in the late 1800s and was tamping explosives on the railroad, and somebody had put explosive down in the hull and forgot to put sand on top of it. And so Gage was tamping this, and a rod about this big around, about this long, see it in a minute, blew up through where that red is coursing, up through his brain and blew out the other side. And this was a reconstruction after that used by Ana Damasio using the skull of Phineas Gage, trying to determine for sure exactly what brain tissue would have been damaged in Gage, because it's a classic case that everybody knows about. So it's really interesting to know what areas of the brain would be damaged. And you can see the midline areas of the frontal cortex, right on the midline, where that anterior cingulate is and other structures were damaged in Gage. And the thing that's interesting about Gage, there he is with that bar that went through his head. First of all, he didn't lose consciousness, and within a few days he was sort of all right, except everybody said that Phineas Gage is no longer Phineas Gage. Because before the accident, he was an intelligent person, he was a capable, efficient worker, an excellent manager of people, responsible family man, a citizen. I mean, it's just you're a really good, dependable person. Afterwards, he maintained his intelligence. This did not change his general knowledge of the world and intelligence and skill in that sense. But what he did become was unreliable and capricious. You could not tell what Phineas Gage was going to do, and you could not rely on him for anything. And he became socially inappropriate. You could not rely on him doing the right thing in a social situation. He would do all kinds of absolutely inappropriate things in social situations. He became amoral. That is not immoral, particularly, but just no moral anchoring at all. So there's nothing about morality that guided Phineas Gage's behavior. It was socially and morally capricious and unpredictable. And of course he lost his job, family, and also was unaware of his problem. People that have this and distort to think they're fine, and everybody else in the world realizes that this person has lost a major anchor. an area in the brain that gets damaged in an accident at that middle frontal area, and a person loses their sort of moral moorings in the world. A moral man, Phineas Gage, tamping powder down holes for his wage, glued the last of his probes through his 2 frontal lobes. Now he drinks, swears, and flies away. Here's it kind of. Here's another study that tells basically the same story. The pink area there in those brains, looking at it at different levels, are the areas that are commonly damaged in a whole series of patients who do not experience regret. So you get, looking through your annals of neurological patients with brain damage, and you find a number of them who do not experience regret, and then you take all their areas of damage and overlay them, and it's pretty much exactly the same area that got damaged in Phineas Gage. So the ability to modulate your behavior by regret from the outcome of previous life experiences is lost in these patients. So their social/moral experience of regret. Recent work has been done involving the solving of moral dilemmas while one is in a scanner. So philosophical ethics has moved forward in the past by how do people solve certain kind of moral dilemmas. So Josh Green at Harvard decided he would have people solve moral dilemmas while in the scanner. So what we have here is the yellow and orange areas are the areas that are particularly active during the difference between solving an easy moral dilemma and a difficult moral dilemma. So a difficult moral dilemma activates more intensely this area, again the anterior cingulate right on the middle in that midline part of the area, or just behind the area, damage in Phineas Gage is down right up through there. Also the posterior cingulate gyrus, an area in the midline parietal, but then 2 areas up the front are very intensely active in the frontal lobes, where you're working hard on solving this moral dilemma. Your frontal lobes are working very hard. So that's one thing. You're solving moral issues in the world is done with certain brain systems working intensely hard. Josh Green also did another interesting version of moral dilemmas. He first did people solving what's called the trolley car dilemma. So the trolley car dilemma is on the top, and the trolley car is coming down here, and the trolley car is going to go this way and kill all 5 people working on the railroad, unless you throw the switch. And if you throw the switch, then the car will go this way, and if you throw the switch, 5 are saved, but 1 person is killed. And most people say this is the morally right thing to do, to go ahead and throw the switch. But the alternative is the footbridge dilemma, and this you have the opportunity, or the part of the problem is, would you push a person off of the bridge in front of the trolley car that would stop the trolley car? Again, 1 person would be killed, the person you push off the bridge, but 5 persons would be saved. And so this big person there is big enough to push him off, and he stops the train, the trolley car, that person is killed. It's the same problem. 5 people are saved and 1 person is killed, and if you're a utilitarian, there is no problem. Of course that's what you would do, but actually most people say that this would not be the morally right thing to do, or at least they could not bring themselves to do that. They could not bring themselves to actually push another person off the bridge. So this is sort of not indirect, like throwing a switch, but direct causing another person to be killed, even in order to save 5 other persons. And so you can imagine how hard these moral dilemmas. And so Josh Green looked at these things when persons are in the scanner, and again, our anterior cingulate area and the midline up the front would be been damaged, and Phineas Gage was very active in this moral dilemma solving. Also 2 areas in the right and left parietal lobe that have a lot to do with understanding ourself and the world. And so you can imagine that simulating or emulating the experience of being that other person in the context of what it would like for me to be that other person and be pushed off the grid is part of what makes it difficult to decide to do that, because we understand the experience of another person in this way. So now let me talk about the really tricky one, and that is religious experience. And I want to talk about it in 4 different areas. One is hallucinogenic drugs in religious experience. The second is temporal lobe epilepsy in religious experience. I just realized I left something important that I want to use here in my briefcase. Put my notes out. Then transcranial magnetic stimulation and brain imaging during religious experience. So first, hallucinogenic drugs. There's just a long and ancient history about the use of hallucinogenic drugs in religious rituals and experience to sort of enhance or create an intense and deep and meaningful religious experience. So this has a long history of using things like mushrooms and peyote cactus and water lilies and whatever else in religious rites in order to create a religious experience. A modern version of this is the Good Friday experiment done at Harvard, and this was back in the 60s. You could not do this experiment now because no institutional review board would permit you to do this experiment. But in the 60s, we didn't have that problem, and so Walter Pahnke did this experiment as his dissertation. And so what he had is a group of students who were given either a placebo or a hallucinogenic drug, LSD, without them knowing which, just prior to listening to a Good Friday service. So in the basement of the church, and they were listening to the whole experience of the Good Friday service. Yeah, some of them were on LSD and some of them weren't. The groups were interviewed immediately afterwards and 6 months later, and the group that had taken LSD rated the religious experience of the service much more intensely and deeply meaningful than the persons that were not taking LSD. So just like had been true in all of these religious rites and experiences and rituals in other cultures where hallucinogenic drugs were taken, you really got the same effect with LSD in these students in the study. And even 6 months later, knowing that they had this experience on LSD, they said, oh, but still that was just such a deep and meaningful and wonderful experience. Well, as it's not hard to imagine, a religious experience is not what everybody gets on LSD. For a lot of people in LSD, it's just a high or low. But it's nothing religious, it's just a trip. And so, for my money, the difference between it being religious and just a trip is the context in which it occurs and the pre-LSD understandings of the world of the person who takes the LSD. Because it's a kind of a generalized phenomenon that activates systems about meaning, but that meaning is nevertheless nested within what you already know and understand about the world. And you're in the context of a religious service going on above you. So context and, I think, pre-experienced life are what make it religious, not the LSD itself. But it certainly has been a physiological response. LSD and hallucinogenic drugs mess with your dopamine and serotonin systems, and we know what these things do, and we know the systems they work in, and you overactivate these systems with these kind of drugs, and you get these kind of experiences. And for my money, they're not uniquely religious, they are in fact uniquely meaningful. We'll talk about that in a minute with respect to epilepsy, which is the next area I want to talk about. Up in the right corner is the EEG tracings you get for a person entering into an epileptic seizure. And so when the lines get heavy and dark and going up and down real rapidly, that's the onset of a seizure. And intense religious experiences have been repeatedly described in the neurological literature as a symptom that sometimes is associated with temporal lobe seizures. Not everybody that gets a particularly right temporal lobe seizure, not everybody that has right temporal lobe epilepsy gets religious experiences. But it's common enough in the neurological literature that this is considered one of the possible symptoms of a temporal lobe seizure. Now, if you permit me, I'd like to read to you from Dostoevsky. Because in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, Prince Mishkin has seizures, as did Dostoevsky. So you imagine this account to be Dostoevsky's own account of his seizures, or at least what he knows about seizures. So, and Mishkin is being referred to here, who has these seizures. And Dostoevsky writes, he fell to thinking that in his attacks of epilepsy there was a pause just before the fit itself, which it seemed his brain was on fire, and in an extraordinary surge all his vital forces would be intensified. The sense of life, the consciousness of self, were multiplied tenfold in these moments, which lasted no longer than a flash of lightning. His mind and heart were flooded with extraordinary light. All torment, all doubt, all anxieties were relieved at once, resolved in a kind of lofty calm, full of serene, harmonious joy and hope, full of understanding and the knowledge of the ultimate cause of things. And then later on, Mishkin, thinking about this more, says to himself, if in that second, that is the lucid moment just before the fit, he had time to say to himself clearly and consciously, yes, one might give one's whole life for this moment, then that moment by itself would be certainly worth the whole of life. So associated with seizure, particularly seizure onset aura, in some patients, particularly with right temporal lobe seizure, is this kind of deep and intensive religious experience, which even Dostoevsky says, recognizing that it's a fit, a seizure, one might in fact give the whole of life for this experience. It's so wonderful. A patient actually described in the neurological literature is described as accounting her seizures this way, or at least one of them. She says, triple halos appeared around the sun. Suddenly the sunlight became intense. I experienced a revelation of God and of all creation glittering under the sun. The sun became bigger and engulfed me. My mind, my whole being was pervaded by a feeling of delight. Again, that's a modern account of an actual patient encountering their seizure. And this is primarily in the right temporal lobe, and in the right temporal lobe, particularly anterior temporal lobe. So this has prompted V.S. Ramachandran, who's a very good neurologist, but for my money says somewhat outrageous things at times, to speculate that this suggests the existence of a God module within the temporal lobe that is dedicated machinery and the temporal lobes concerned with religion. But again, like with LSD, some people get temporal lobe seizures that are very deep and meaningful, and they don't recount these as religious. I think a better theory is Safer and Rubin's theory that suggests what he calls a limbic marker hypothesis. That is, limbic system tags certain encounters as crucially important, harmonious, and or joyous, prompting comprehension of these experiences within a religious framework. And I think particularly post-hoc comprehension, that is one's view of these after the fact. If you tend to have a religious framework already, you will recount these experiences as religious. But if you don't happen to have a religious framework already, this is just, wild and wonderful and halos and other things, but they're not recounted as religious. I think that's a better way to think about what is going on here. Out of this literature, people generally using now for a whole lot of reasons what's called transcranial magnetic stimulation, so that little round thing is a magnetic stimulator, and you can move it over different parts of the head, and you can do it in a way that either stimulates or inhibits the area under the magnetic stimulator. And so a guy named Michael Persinger up in Canada did some work with right temporal lobe magnetic resonance stimulation and claimed that transcranial magnetic stimulation of the right temporal lobe significantly increases the reports of a sense of presence. So people would report feeling the presence of God or the presence of angels or ghosts or important other people. And so he presumed, therefore, big jump, that persons who are having religious experiences are having micro-seizures of the right temporal lobe. So his sort of reductionist, determinist argument about religiousness is his micro-seizures of the right temporal lobes. But he also thinks that similar explanations can be given of other paranormal experiences, like reports of aliens and ghosts and whatever things that you're having micro-seizures of the right temporal lobe, and that's really what determines all this. It's not clinically detectable seizures, but they must be there because if you're going to have a religious experience, it must be like what's going on in temporal epilepsy, because it couldn't have any others. So then a lot of work has been done recently in using neuroimaging techniques of persons during religious experiences. So Andy Newberg did some work with nuns meditating and Buddhist monks meditating, some meditation. This was single proton emission computed tomography, SPECT scans. And to do a SPECT scan, you have to have an IV, and you have to inject a tracer element, and then run the person off to a scanner to scan the areas that get activated, or during that time when you injected the scanner, before the scan, the substance disappears that you injected it and is taken out by the areas that are active. So a Buddhist monk would be sitting there meditating and have a little button. At the time he got deeply into meditation and that experience of oneness and whatever in meditation, press a button, inject a dye, run them off to the scanner. That's kind of stuff you get. So what Newberg is kind of famous for demonstrating, that was people in meditation compared to baseline have increased activation of the frontal lobe generally. And his explanation to that is this kind of meditation takes intensive mind control and focus, and therefore the frontal areas of the brain become highly active to get that level of focus. And then that there's decreased activity in the right parietal lobe. And the right parietal lobe, again, is having to do with our understanding of ourselves as beings in our environment. And during this kind of meditation, you've got a kind of an out-of-body or experience that you are somehow translocated, you're no longer here, and that experience is associated with diminution of activity in the right parietal. There's other work that's been done like this. Nina Aziri in Hawaii has done some work with people meditating on scripture, Christians meditating on scripture, meditating on scriptures that they find particularly enlightening and important to them. And you find a different pattern of brain activity for meditating on scripture than you do this kind of meditation. Interestingly, Newberg also did a study of glossolalia, speaking in tongues. And so what he would do there is, again, you have to have the IVs in, and then you have a person in a group service, and when they begin to speak in tongues, you inject the dye, run them off to the scanner, and scan their brain. And the alternative was people just ecstatic kind of singing, but not speaking in tongues. So he had a control condition, somewhat like it physically and emotionally, but not exactly the same, not speaking in tongues. So what they found was decreased activity in the frontal lobes. Now remember, religious meditation is increasing activity, this is decreased activity. Decreased activity in the left temporal lobe, temporal pole and caudate nucleus. That area would be involved in language production. Particularly the caudate would be interacting with the cortical areas involved in language production. So these are decreased. So the kinds of things that are normally involved in language production are actually decreased during speaking in tongues, and increased activity in the left parietal area. Well, generally these are, to some degree, particularly the frontal and parietal things almost opposite what he saw in meditation. All right, so the point is, I think in all of this, is the brain patterns that are found there's no brain pattern that is unique to religious experience. It really depends on the kind of religious activity you are involved in at the time. If you are meditating like a Buddhist or a nun might meditate, you'll get one pattern experience, brain pattern. If you're meditating on scripture, you'll get another brain pattern. If you are an expressive glossolalia, you'll get another kind of pattern. But the pattern is not unique to religiousness. It's the context and the assumed worldview of the person who is in the experience that makes it religious, not something unique about the brain. Again, I think there's this tendency in neurobiology and particularly human neuroscience to go looking inside the brain for unique patterns of everything that seems to be uniquely human. So if religiousness is uniquely human, it must lie in some unique structure in the brain that is somehow genetically there because we're genetically human, as opposed to being a cultural thing that gets embedded in us as we experience life, particularly in life in religious communities. So my conclusions from the neuropsychology of religiousness: religious experiences are associated with patterns of brain activity. They're not happening in some non-material sort of world of the soul. They're happening to me as a physical being. These are part of what I encounter as a physical person in the world. The specific patterns differ based on the form of religious activity and experience. Therefore, there is not one specific brain area that mediates religious experience, the God module notwithstanding. There is no God. And the religious experiences studied are often unusual and not normative for most religious persons and groups. So the one thing that bugs me no end is when somebody takes something like Buddhist meditation, which is a religious experience and practice of some persons, but is not normative for all of the religious world, and acts as though the brain systems you see active in meditation are exactly what you're going to find in all religiousness. In fact, most of these people, some I know, really don't quite have a clue what it means to live religiously, to be actually involved in religious life and religious community. And so they look at one little thing and they say, oh, religiousness, we'll look at that. And so now we have captured the brain processes for religion. So the questions raised by all this research, religion and morality and relatedness, are things like, if interpersonal relationships are brain events, what is the nature of love and compassion, or rivalry, jealousy, and hatred? How do we understand these things? Are these merely reducible to my brain? If brain damage affects our ability to act morally, are we moral agents, or are we merely determined products of our brain activity? And you can certainly make me immoral by blasting out my midline frontal areas. But is that all that morality is? If religious experiences can occur from abnormal brain activity, such as hallucinogenic drugs or temporal lobe epilepsy, what should we believe about normal religious experiences? Are these reducible? If they are convincingly physical, are they therefore reducible? So, general conclusions, one might say it's becoming increasingly difficult to find an area of human cognition, affect, what should you say, social, moral, or religious functioning that has not already been shown to have correlates and identifiable patterns of brain activity. These things are all a part of our embodied life in the world, and our brains and bodies are involved in this. So if the brain does all this, what does the soul, mind, or self do if you understand the soul, mind, or self as a separate thing rather than as a descriptive property of me? It's a descriptive property of me give you an alternative formulation to get us out of this limited materialism versus dualism. And so the problem, remember the knotty problem is that for dualism, if we're non-physical, if we have a non-physical soul or mind, how can you account for the impact of brain disorder on humankind and moral, social, relational, religious, whatever. And materialism, if humans are nothing but biology, where is human personhood, agency, value, and dignity to be found? Is there an alternative to eliminative materialism other than Cartesian dualism that is consistent with modern neuroscience, in which mental life has a causal role? Underlying cause, our mental life actually is causal in the world and cannot be entirely reduced to the physics and chemistry and physiology of our brains and bodies. Those are important. Those are there, but you can't entirely reduce them to that. And in which human beings have genuine interpersonal relationships, moral agency, and religious experiences. Genuine in the sense these are a part of us as whole persons that cannot be reduced to the level of neurobiology. So let me give you, in this conflicting views, with Proposition 3. Proposition 3 is humans are complex, physical beings who express emergent properties of mind, that is, non-reducible properties of the whole person that are causal in behavior. This is called emergentism, and represents really a conceptual revolution or a change that's kind of going along in a number of fields, although actually its origins are fairly old. Accumulating evidence in neurobiology, systems theory, philosophy of mind, this kind of argument and thought process going on in a lot of areas. Position held in various forms by philosophers and sciences of various kinds. Nancy Murphy there is my colleague at Fuller. Alicia Barrero wrote a very good book called Dynamics in Action, which is both Aristotelian philosophy of human nature coupled with dynamic systems analysis of systems and emergent properties in systems. Very good book. So forth. In this emergent view, words like mind, soul, and self are verbs. They're process words. I don't have a mind, I mind. I don't have a soul, I soul. It's a process word. It's a functional word of things I do. I don't have a self. Self is a description of the unique ways I as a person interact with the world. It's not a separate thing inside of me. So it's a whole psychology that goes, clinical psychology that goes forward, this kind of reified the idea of self as some kind of a separate agent inside of you that's different than you as a whole person as an agent in the world. And this means, therefore, we are embodied. That is, who we are involves the brain and the body, but we are also embedded. That is, we are present and contextualized in interactions in the world. Who we are as a self and a person are contextualized in our interactions in the world. And thirdly, they are emergent. That is, they are non-reducible properties of physical human beings. The terminology that Nancy Murphy and I have used at times is non-reductive physicalism. So I'll give you the definition of the terminology. This is what I consider to be minimalist philosophical descriptions of this position. Minimalist in the sense that it gives you the minimal basis. It doesn't derive the complexity that you're looking for in human life. But physicalism means it's not necessary to postulate a second entity, a soul or mind, a second entity, to account for human capacities and distinctiveness. Souling and minding are physiologically embodied. They're part of the things I do as a whole physical person in the world. And it's non-reductive in the sense that human behavior cannot be exhaustively explained by analysis of lower levels being neurophysiology, neurochemistry, chemistry, physics, and so forth. Higher level causal properties emerge. They emerge, it's not that The properties at the level of physics and physiology are not going on and are not necessary to be there for emergence to occur. It's just what emerges is the outcome property of the whole complex interactive system as a system. And as a system, it becomes a force in the world that can't be reduced to just the physiology and physics at the lower levels. Therefore, top-down causation exists. So if I decide something, or if somebody says something to me that changes my understanding of the world, it has a top-down impact on my physiological system. Donald Mackay, who I showed you before, talked about belief as a conditional readiness to reckon. That as I believe something by being ready under the appropriate conditions to reckon with whatever I believe to be true. So if you tell me Barack Obama is standing outside the door up here, if I believe you, when I walk out the door, my nervous system is conditionally ready to deal with a person like Barack Obama sitting outside the door. If I do not believe you, I walk out the door with no change in my physiological state. So that's top-down causation. My nervous system, my whole body, I am ready to deal with something out there if I believe you. If I don't believe what you said, regardless of what you say, I walk out the door, just the same as I would had you not said that. So that's the idea of top-down causation. And therefore, our thinking is efficacious. That is, our thinking is not epiphenomenal. Our thinking is actually part of us as an agent and an emergent property that has causal force in the world. So, that is my solution. We wrote a whole book, the one you referred to, Did My Neurons Make Me Do It, trying to work out the issue of free will against the problems of determinism and reductionism, whether this is either environmentally determined or biologically determined, particularly biologically. First of all, let me talk about LeVay's experiment, because that's complicated with a little knowing. So in this experiment, people brought into the lab and they said, "I want you to press a button every now and then," and you just decide when to press a button. But there's this clock thing going around, and we want you to know when it is you decided to press the button and then press the button, so that we can know both the time of your decided to and the time you press the button. And what they found is there was slow process brainwave activity that precedes motor action that occurred prior to the time in which the person said they made the decision. So the implication was this: the decision was made by your bodily systems before you actually even were aware that you were going to make that decision. Of course, so therefore your decisions are entirely predetermined. But my critique of that is, first of all, the people agreed to come into the lab, and they agreed to sit down there and get involved themselves in this kind of experiment and do this kind of thing. And that's one part. Second part is that I really think a lot of our behavior is in fact governed that way, by permission. That is, I permit myself to go on LeVay's experiment and to do these kind of things. And therefore, I've always, in a sense, given agented free will permission to be a part of this experiment. And if my bodily system is running in a kind of unconscious mode, then that doesn't change the fact that I sort of gave my permission to be there. So a lot of people in cognitive psychology now talk about the fact that something like only 5% of our actions and behavior during a day's time are actually consciously decided at the moment. The rest of it just goes off automatically because we have to kind of generally give myself permission to do this kind of thing. I used to drive to UCLA every day from Pasadena, which is a long traffic light commute, and I'd get to Pasadena and I'd have park my car and think, I have no idea what I just did. What happened. You know, I can tell you what I was thinking about, what's going through my mind, but I have no idea. The whole process of driving was entirely run off below the level of consciousness. So if you limit free will to consciousness, then I think you have, I just don't think that's merited. I think a lot of our behavior that's agented in the sense that it's what I want to do is in fact decided in some other context at some other time, earlier in the day or some other point in my life. And at this point in my life, this is entirely somewhat automatic behavior. When you learn to drive a car, you are very conscious. It's very conscious activity, and you have to think about what you're doing now. Once you're an experienced driver, you do this entirely unconsciously. You no longer have to be conscious about this, but that doesn't make driving necessarily not a part of me as an agent. It's just that right now my consciousness is not running that agency. That part of my agency is being run in my subconscious, automatic, implicit motor systems. My basal ganglia and my cerebellum, if you want to know the motor structures, are running off this behavior. So I think that's what's happening in the Bayes experiment. You sit me down, I've got myself in the thing, and I know how to press buttons or whatever. And so my consciousness really doesn't have to run this experiment. It really doesn't come in. And in fact, if you think about it, life is way too complex to track consciously in decision-making about everything we do. I mean, it's just way too, it would flood our consciousness. So consciousness cannot take care of all of the things we do. A lot of it has to be done on a subconscious level. But all of that subconscious level is something at some level I permit, I don't interrupt. And at another level, I've learned this in giving in sense consent to certain kinds of formative experiences in my path that now are implicit in me. And I do these things and they're part of me. And it's who I give myself permission to be, and it's very automatic. And I can give these lectures, it's very kind of automatic sometimes. I try to think about that.
All right, other questions?
One other thing I would add to that is Nancy Murphy and I in writing Did My Neurons Make Me Do It? Did not want to include in the title free will, because free will has and the idea somehow you could do just about anything. And I don't think humans can do just about anything. What we do is something that's chosen from the things we know are possible in the world because of our life experience. And so we are more willing to talk about true moral agency than actual free will, because free will actually has kind of a strange overlay.
They say 90% of your decision making is at subconscious level. So how does the subconscious, that means basal ganglia, cerebellum, and limbic system, how do they decide which decisions to be referred to the higher cortical level to answer, and which decisions they can, as an automaton, make a decision?
Yeah, you know, that is one of the kind of fundamental problems of consciousness. I mean, one of the big sort of cutting edge areas is what is the nature of consciousness to start with. What determines what enters consciousness and what does not enter consciousness. I really think that consciousness and something like working memory is fairly overlapping consciousness. So the things that I need to process at a conscious level in order to manipulate working memory information are the kind of stuff that my consciousness is needed for. And if it's not needed for that, then I can rely on my basal ganglia and my cerebellum and all the kind of automaticity systems to run off those behaviors. So when driving to UCLA, I didn't need consciousness to run off all those things. What my consciousness needed for was what computer program I was going to be working on when I got there, so I was thinking about that or whatever else was going on at the time. So yeah, that's a really tricky, interesting question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about hypnotism? I mean, there's, you know, the acts and everything, but what happens when your consciousness is suppressed and somebody will do something on stage, you know, silly, run around and cluck like a chicken and stuff like that, and not remember it? What happens in that process where they suppress your consciousness?
Yeah, well, first of all, this tells you that a lot of very sophisticated behavior and even somewhat sophisticated cognition can go on without the necessity of consciousness because it's built into the lower brain system. I talked about the cerebellum. I just learned last week that, I think, I haven't checked this, but a pretty credible science paper I was listening to. I said 80% of the neurons in the brain are in the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, which is a structure used to embody kind of automatic, habitual ways of being in the world, ways of acting, ways of doing, is a very sophisticated structure. And so it's very actually involved in our higher cognitive processes, but below the level of consciousness. So there are all kinds of very sophisticated things that could go on without needing consciousness to operate them. So when you are in think something like hypnotism or other kinds of places where consciousness is kind of suppressed or used for something else, that there are still very sophisticated brain-body systems that can modulate and create and guide very sophisticated behavior without the consciousness having to be involved. So I think that's kind of the explanation of some of those strange relationships between what is really conscious and what we're doing at the time. And we've got very sophisticated systems that operate below the level of consciousness.
Is to me, a vague notion of muscle memory is that a form of
I don't think
subconscious activity?
muscles have memories because muscles don't have neural networks with synapses. But all the things that are controlling our muscle systems all the way up from our spinal cord systems and particularly up in our cerebellum and brain systems have synaptic connections that allow for learning. So we absolutely have motor behavior learning that is very non-conscious. So we call it muscle memory, but it's really the memory of ways of acting in the world in sophisticated ways. We were talking about this at dinner. I have a motor memory, but it's not in my motor system, but it's a motor system memory of how to ride a bicycle. But it's not very conscious. I mean, it's hard even for me to get a very vivid bodily image of what it's like to ride a bike and to tell you that, and it's almost impossible. But you give me the bicycle, and I absolutely know how to ride a bicycle. I've got a motor memory, and I don't ride one very often, but I can still ride a bike because I rode them a lot as a kid. So I've got a muscle motor memory. It's a motor memory, really, not a muscle memory. I guess that's what you say.
I'm kind of following up on that. I find myself wondering, I keep asking the question, how did that stuff get there? So it's easy for me to see, as you've demonstrated, that those parts of the brain are activated or they respond when they are called on to respond. But certainly an infant would not have any feeling of social exclusion or empathy or moral decision making.
The best paradigm, this is a whole other lecture, actually it's a whole class. The best paradigm and description that I think is true of brain physiology systems, both at the animal level and human level, is they are dynamical systems. And dynamical systems are complex systems that have emergent properties that self-organize. And so I think the thing about the human brain is that although it has a genetic structure and a genetic form and kind of functional distribution, within that it's a self-organizing system, which means it's dynamically self-organizing during child development. There's a very good book by Stephen Quartz, one of my colleagues at Caltech, and Michael Sanowski called Liars, Lovers, and Heroes. And it's a book about child development. And their premise is that humans develop the sophisticated social beings that they are because their brain develops more slowly than the brain of a chimpanzee. So the brain of a chimpanzee has pretty well reached adult maturity by 2 years. A human brain is still developing some systems into puberty, and some people think my favorite structure, the corpus callosum, is not entirely myelinated until late into puberty, maybe even into the 20s. So if you have a very slow brain development in the context of a self-organizing system that is embedded in a complex social culture, social and artifactual culture, then what gets organized into the brain is this sort of understanding of this social, artifactual, cognitive world. And to talk about the relationship between artifacts and my organization, one of my favorite quotes, philosopher of mine, Andy Clark, said that we make the world smart so that we can be dumb in peace. And by that he means a lot of our intelligence is not just in here, but it's like the bicycle. It's built into my organizational interactions with the physical and social nature of the world. So they're, in some sense, here rather than here, or at least it takes this to elicit whatever it is in here that allows me to be a part of this in a complicated and intelligent way.
I'll take one more question, John.
If someone gave you a big fat research grant and you could deploy it however you wanted, what would you most like to see figured out?
I just got a research grant. Myself and Greg Peterson, who's up at South Dakota State University, and a neurobiologist at Caltech, and a moral psychologist, a friend of mine from Azusa Pacific University, just got $1,200,000 from Templeton Foundation to study the virtues of compassion and generosity. And this is actually an extension of 3 years of work we've already done on looking at what is the nature of brain processing and psychological makeup of persons who are exemplars of virtue. And so our exemplars of virtue are caregivers in marsh communities, at least one of the exemplars of virtue. So that we're kind of often studying virtue right now. So that's what I got the grant for, and having gotten that grant, I really don't want another one. I'll be busy enough.
I'll keep that $1 million.
Okay.
I got here for you. No, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Rapp for his talk tonight. We, in the sort of fashion we've been doing these talks, Dr. Brown's agreed to go with us to a restaurant in town, Leo's Bar and Grill.
Nice.
So if you want to ask other questions of him, there's usually a small gathering of us that meet up there. You're all welcome to come. Please join us now.
Besides that, I'm an old-time pilot, so hanging out in bars now.
But also I just want to announce, so the next talk in this series will be April 9th with Dr. Jesse Barron. He wrote a book recently called The Belief Instinct, and so that is a little bit more talking about how different cultures and religious, sort of groups have this sort of, what he calls this, innate instinct to believe in something, a God or these kinds of ideas. So